Welcome to the only finance museum in the country with a core mission to preserve, exhibit, and teach about our nation's finances and financial history. We are a nonprofit, a Smithsonian affiliate, and I'm David Cowan, president of the museum. I am joined today by our board chair, Professor Richard Sylla, and 10,000 of you who join us live as we stream this over our YouTube channel in partnership with Bloomberg for Education. And I would like to thank Rob Langrick and Blair Wilkie from Bloomberg for making this possible. And all of you today are a part of history, as we have never live streamed an event. This is the first one that we are doing. Our guest tonight is Aswath Damodaran. He is a professor of finance at NYU's Stern School of Business. There he holds the Kirshner Chair in Finance Education. He has received many accolades in his career, including 3 fellowships. He's been named by Fortune magazine to be one of the top 50 business school professors. He's published scores, literally scores of articles in academic journals. His book, of course, Narrative and Numbers, The Value of Stories in Business. This book will be on sale after for those that are here. The professor would be happy to autograph it if you are so inclined to purchase it. Now, you have 3x5 cards in front of you. Please fill those out with any questions you may have. We'll collect those at the end for the professor to answer. Now, in the conclusion of the book, the professor says how much he enjoyed writing the book, and he says, quote unquote, that he hopes his joy shows through. We certainly hope that your joy shows through tonight, Professor Damodaran.
So 10,000 people watching, huh? I could really screw up here, right? Big time, but I'm not planning to. I came to NYU in 1986, and when I came to NYU, I was given a class to teach. It was called Security Analysis. For those of you who don't know the history of that class, it has a very long and hoary tradition. It's a class that Ben Graham taught at Columbia in the 1950s that Warren Buffett taught. So he gave me this class to teach, and by 1986 it was showing its age because it was a collection of topics, and I took one look and said, I don't want to teach this class. It's the most boring class I can think of. Because here's what it was. It was 3 weeks on stocks, and 2 weeks on bonds, and 2 weeks on futures, and 1 week on options, and 5 weeks on institutional details. You're saying like what? There was an entire session on listing requirements for the New York Stock Exchange. Teaching was so easy in the days before Wikipedia. You could actually show up and list out the 12 requirements, and people thought you were a genius. You can't pull that off anymore. So I went to the head of my department and I said, I don't want to teach this class. Not a great attitude if you've just been hired as an assistant professor. He said, what would you like to teach instead? I said, I'd like to teach a valuation class. He said, don't do it. There isn't enough stuff in valuation to actually fill a class. And you know what? He was absolutely right. In 1986, there wasn't enough stuff in valuation to fill a class. But I really wanted to teach this class. I learned very early in my academic life that if you want to get something done in academia, the best way to get it done is to do it subversively. Because if you try to get official permission, you know what would happen, right? A committee would be formed. You know what happens after committees get formed? They report to other committees, which report to other committees. And by the time they got back to me and said, you can teach the class, I'd be ready to retire. So I said, okay, I'll teach the security analysis class. And I walked in and taught a valuation class. They have no idea what I do in a classroom. You know how long it took them to catch on? I get a call in 2008 from the dean's office. We hear you're teaching a valuation class. I said, I've been doing it for 22 years. He said, we don't see it on the schedule. I said, that's very simple to explain. I've been hijacking all these other classes you've been giving me and teaching valuation classes instead. This is my 31st year teaching valuation, my 53rd semester. And I'll say something about this class. Everything I know about valuation, I've learned in the course of teaching this class. So, start of the semester, I walked in the class of 300. My classes are pretty big classes. It's an MBA class. I looked out and asked a question. I'm going to ask that question of you, and I'd like you to look inwards. There's no right answer to the question. Don't look at your neighbor. This has nothing to do with your neighbor. It's about you. So here's my question. If I asked you to classify yourself as a person, would you more naturally think of yourself as a storyteller or a number cruncher? Think about it for just a moment. Are you more naturally a storyteller or a number cruncher? You think, how would I know? You know. You've known for a long time. I'll tell you when I knew. I knew when I was about 13 or 14, right after my first English literature class. I was asked to read Moby Dick, and I did. I was a good kid. And I came to class ready for a discussion of whales and captains. So I show up in class, and there's nary a mention of whales or captains. And about 15 minutes into class, the instructor says there's no whale. I said, what? I remember a big fish all the way through the book. It says no captain. And then she started talking about all these hidden meanings in the book. And I remember sitting there saying, really? That's what Herman Melville was thinking when he wrote that? And I remember walking out of that class with a singular thought. I said, never again am I going to subject myself to that kind of bullshit. And my life was laid out for me, because after that I avoided the literature classes like the plague. To me it was Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Algebra 3 out of high school. And these were the good old days. When if you went to college, you didn't have this core curriculum that they torture you with now. You know what I'm talking about? 2 years of classes you don't want to take. Why? Because you have to take them. It's how we keep history departments employed, I guess. But in those days, you could just take numbers classes, you could get a numbers degree, and you could go to work in a numbers discipline. Like what? In accounting, banking, actuary, engineers. So when I asked this question in my class, remember it's evaluation class, now how many of you are number crunchers? 180 out of the 300 put up there. So more naturally number crunchers. But go back to that first literature class. There were people who loved this kind of stuff, hidden meanings. They're the ones who write poetry. I've never quite understood them. My youngest son writes poetry. He showed me the first poem he wrote. He's never shown me another poem since. Because I took one look and said, Kiran, I think we have a problem here. Aren't the last words supposed to rhyme? Because that's the way I've always written poetry. He said, Dad, you're not a poet. And I said, Kiran, you're right. There are people who love that stuff. They, of course, go on to take Literature 1, Literature 2, Literature 3, and they become history majors at Yale. And they discover that even Yale history majors don't make very much money. So 3 or 4 years later, guess where they are? They're in my MBA class. They're the other 120 people in my class. I've got 180 number crunchers and 120 storytellers. And of course, at that point in time, the number crunchers think they have the advantage. They say, what are you doing in this class? It's a valuation class. It's all about numbers. That's when I have to let them in on what I think is the biggest hidden secret in valuation. Valuation is never just about the numbers. If your valuation is just a collection of numbers on a spreadsheet, it's not a valuation, it's a collection of numbers on a spreadsheet. Valuation, as I see it, is a bridge between stories and numbers. Let me explain. If you do a good valuation and I point to a number in your valuation and say, why is your revenue 80 billion in year 10? You know what the answer I don't want to hear is? It's because I used a 15% growth rate for the first 5 years and 6% thereafter. I want to know what your story is about this company that will allow them to deliver $80 billion in revenues. Every number in your spreadsheet needs a story to back it up. Conversely, if you're a storyteller and you talk about your great brand name, I'm going to push you on and say, what does that mean? What number is that going to show up in? So when I look at my class, I tell them what my end game is for the class. I say, by the end of this class, here's what I hope will happen. I turn to the storytellers and say, by the end of this class, I hope you develop enough number crunching skills that you develop some discipline. Because let's face it, the weakness of being a storyteller is you love telling fairy tales. You like being creative. We all have our own delusions. Here are the delusions of the storytellers. Storytellers think that being creative should bring its own reward. I told you such a good story. I must be worth at least 5 billion, right? Let me inflate my story a little bit more. Now it's 10 billion. Storytellers are also convinced that number crunchers dream in black and white. They can't dream in technicolor. And finally, storytellers love using anecdotal evidence. They're like my mother-in-law. And I don't mean that as a compliment. My mother-in-law comes up with these most outlandish conclusions. Like I remember about 10 years ago at dinner, she announces that the best car to drive in a snowstorm is a Volkswagen Bug. Remember the old Bugs, the cars you could pick up and just move around if you wanted to? I remember asking, Judy, how do you come to this conclusion? And she told me, I should stop asking her these questions because she always tells me. She said 25 years ago, she was driving in Lake Tahoe in a snowstorm in a Volkswagen bug. And there were 2 cars in front of her that went off the road, and she got home safe. She says, so? I said, that proves it, right? Sample size of 1. Amazing how she can extrapolate from there. So left to their own devices, storytellers have no discipline. I said, by the end of this class, I hope you develop enough number crunching skills that you develop some discipline. Then I turn to the number crunchers. And number crunchers have their own delusions, right? And there are 3 delusions I can point to. And as a number cruncher, and if you're a number cruncher, I'd like you to ask whether you share these same delusions. The first is what I call the delusion of precision. I only half-jokingly say that when a number cruncher feels uncertain, you know what he or she does? Adds decimals. I'm uncertain, let me add a decimal. I don't feel comfortable enough, let me make it 4 decimals. The second is the delusion of being objective. I'm using numbers. Look, I'm not biased, as if using numbers makes you objective. And the third is the delusion of being in control. You think you're in control because you have a number for something. So I turn to the number crunchers and say, by the end of this class, I hope you develop an imagination. Here's my definition of somebody's good at valuation: a disciplined storyteller or an imaginative number cruncher. I told you this is the 53rd semester I've been teaching this class. Guess who I have more trouble with? Getting storytellers to develop discipline or getting number crunchers to develop an imagination. It's not even close. Every semester I teach this class, I can get storytellers to be disciplined a lot easier than number crunchers to be imaginative. You give me 100 history majors, I can teach them enough valuation that they can be valuing companies tomorrow. Give me 100 engineers, I am sunk. I am sunk because you've spent a lifetime bludgeoning that little bit of creative imagination. You bludgeoned it into the ground, it won't even, it's dead. I've got to bring it back to life, and it takes a lot of work. I'll make a confession before I get started. I told you I'm a natural number cruncher. When I first started teaching this class in 1986, I taught it as a number cruncher. You know what that means? It was all numbers all the time. Everything I talked about was connected with numbers. And about 6 years into this class, I realized I had a problem. And here's what the problem was. I could value a company, but I had absolutely no faith in my own valuations. That's a strange word to use, right? Faith. But think of why you value companies. You don't value companies because you're intellectually curious. At least I don't. Maybe you do. You value companies because you want to act on those valuations, right? So if you find something to be undervalued, you want to be willing to buy it. And I discovered 6 years into this process that I could value a company. I could follow every mechanical rule. But after I was done, I was not willing to act on that valuation. Why? Because it's a collection of numbers. I knew how easily I could move my numbers around and get the value to be a different number. That's when I knew that I had to change the way I did valuation. And what I had to change was to start telling stories. And the first time I tried was like the first time I tried cooking. I tried to scramble an egg. It did not end well. Nobody told me you're supposed to spray the pan before you put the egg in there. I scrambled the egg. It looked good, but I couldn't get it off the pan. Both pan and egg went into the trash can. The first time I tried to tell a story was like pulling teeth. I think I've become a little better over time in terms of telling stories. And what I'd like to do is take you on a journey of how I've tried to teach myself enough storytelling so that my valuations actually have a soul. That's a strange word, again, to use in the context of evaluation, but valuations increasingly to me are soulless. They're just spreadsheets with numbers that are connected to nothing. If you want your valuation to have a soul, to have meaning, those numbers need a story. So here's what I do. If you ask me to value a company, no matter what company it is, it could be Coca-Cola, it could be Snap, it could be Uber, I go through a 5-step process. Why 5 steps? Remember, I'm a number cruncher. I'm a linear thinker. I have to think in steps. So if you're a storyteller and you don't like steps, jumble them all up, do it your own way. When I sit down to value a company, the first step is to actually tell a story about a company. So I'm going to take you through that process of how I try to tell a story. To tell a story, you have to understand the company. You have to understand the business. You have we talk about this loosely. You don't have to understand the bit, but we never really put flesh on what that actually means. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of what I need to do to understand a business before I tell a story about the business. The second step in the process is I have to stop and ask 3 questions. Is this story possible? Is this story plausible? Is this story probable? Possible, plausible, probable. Weakest test is possible. The second weakest test is lots of things are possible, a subset of them are plausible, an even smaller subset are probable. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? Third step in the process, once I've decided my story is possible, plausible, and probable, is I've got to convert my story into numbers, inputs into evaluation. And if there's an art to valuation or a craft to valuation, that's what you need to work on, is when you tell a story, how do you connect the story to numbers? Once I've converted my story into valuation inputs, the valuation kind of does itself. The spreadsheet is output from my inputs. And then comes the most difficult part. You've told a story about a company. You converted that story into valuation. Do you like your own valuation? Of course you do. It's your story, your valuation. So when you present it to people, what would you like them to do? Pat you on the back and say, that's amazing. That's exactly the way I'd value the company too. I have some advice for you. Don't waste your time with those people. Don't hang out with people who think just like you, because they'll say, hey, this is amazing. This is exactly how we should be valuing companies. Seek out people who think least like you, who are most likely to disagree with you. And you know what they're going to tell you? Your valuation is awful. You missed this, you missed that. Be willing to listen. I call this keeping the feedback loop open. And it's really, really difficult to do, because my first reaction when I value a company and somebody says you're wrong is to get defensive. And I have to learn not to get defensive. So I'm going to use 2 companies to illustrate this process. And I've picked 2 companies that most of you should be familiar with. So as I tell the story, here's what I want you to think about. Think about parts of my story you don't like. And by the end of the session, hopefully I'll give you enough tools that you can take your story for these companies and make it your valuation. So here are the 2 companies I'm going to use. The first is Uber. How many people here came here on an Uber? Okay, that's not bad. New York, but usually in most cities, it's amazing how many people have come on an Uber. So I'm going to talk about a story and evaluation I did of Uber in June of 2014. You're saying, why does the timing matter? Because your story can change over time. The second company I'm going to use to illustrate this process is Ferrari at the time of their IPO in late 2015. Ferrari's been around since 1948. But in the 1960s, Enzo Ferrari had some financial trouble and sold off 90% of Ferrari to Fiat Chrysler. And for 50 years, it stayed part of Fiat Chrysler. Fiat Chrysler in 2015 spun off Ferrari as an IPO. So I'm going to tell you the story and the valuation I had for Ferrari. These are my stories and my valuations. I'm not trying to claim ownership, but I'm saying when you look at these companies, I expect you to have a different story and a different valuation, because that's the essence of investing. So here's the first step in the process. You ask me to value a company, I have to understand what it does. I call this surveying the landscape rather than doing research, because the reason I didn't say do research is increasingly when you say do research, we're trained to go look up 10Ks and annual reports and financial statements and data. That's not research to me. Research is understanding what the company does, what it produces, who buys stuff from it, why they buy the stuff from it, who works at the company. And the best place to find this is not by reading financial statements, but by talking to people, and more important, listening to people. You cannot value a company unless you understand the company and the business itself. So let me take you back in time. June of 2014, I'm reading the Wall Street Journal and I see a little article. And here's what it says. A company called Uber had raised money from venture capitalists who had priced the company at $17 billion. Notice the word I used. What did I just say? Price the company, as opposed to what? Value the company. Never use the word valued and VC in the same sentence. Venture capitalists don't value companies, they price companies. What do they price it on? Based on what other people are paying for other companies, which is fine. That's their job. They price the company at $17 billion. And I'll make a confession. I live underground in New York City. I don't take cabs, I don't take Uber, I didn't take ride-sharing services. I basically live on the subway. I don't take taxis. I'd never heard of Uber. Let me take that back. I'd seen the word Uber on my credit card statements for the previous 3 months leading into June of 2014. Turned out that my second son, who was going to college in North Carolina, was using Uber and using my credit card to back up Uber. Don't ask me how this happened. But I thought he was taking German language classes, to be quite honest, right? So the no umlaut on the U should have kind of given it away. I had no idea what they did. So I decided to find out. I called my son. It was only 11:30 in the morning. He was still sleeping. It's college student hours. So I called my niece, who had a job, so she had to get up, and she lived in Chicago, and I said, what's this Uber thing? She said, it's a ride-sharing service. I said, what the heck is a ride-sharing service? She said, I don't have the time to explain this to you. I have to go to work. Why don't you download the app and find out for yourself? Extremely rude. I should talk to her mother about this. So she hangs up the phone. I download the app. I hit the app, and amazing things start to happen on my phone. A GPS opens up, and a car starts driving towards me. And this is New York City. I can see him hitting every one-way street and having to turn around. And there's a guy called George sitting in the... This has never happened to me with a yellow cab. The guy pulls up in front of 44 West 4th Street, which is where I work. I run and say, hi, George. And he says, where do you want to go? I says, nowhere. But can you drive me around for about 40 minutes? I have some questions to ask you. He thought I was a serial killer for a moment. But then he took one look at me and said, I can take this guy, get in the back seat. So I get in the back seat and start asking him questions. I said, it's an Uber car you're driving. He said, no, this is my car. He said, are you an Uber employee? He said, I'm an independent contractor. I said, why do you do this? He says, I have a regular job. They don't pay me enough. I already own this car. It allows me to earn a second income. I said, why do you need this Uber service? They said, without Uber, I can't pick up customers. It's illegal in New York City to pull up to somebody on the sidewalk and say, do you want a ride? Uber connects me with customers. So at that stage, I kind of knew why the driver used Uber. He needed Uber to connect with customers. It allowed him to earn a second income on something he already owned, a car. So 40 minutes later, he drops me off. I offer to pay him. He says, you don't have to pay me. I said, it's free? He says, no, it's not free. When you downloaded the app, they ask you for a credit card number. I said, yes. So they're going to charge you. I said, how do you get paid? And remember what he said. He said, they're going to send me 80% of whatever your fare is. And I followed up and said, why 80%? He said, I don't know. That's what they all do. So I got out of the car. I kind of had a sense of why Uber did what they did. They don't own the cars, they don't hire the drivers, and they get to keep 20% of your fare for basically being brokers, middlemen, right? So I knew why drivers drove for Uber. I knew why Uber did what they did. The one final piece was, why do customers like Uber? So I called my son this time at what I thought a civilized hour when he was awake, like 3:30 in the afternoon. And I put him under the cross-examination. First, I put him on the defensive, because I've discovered as a parent, the minute you put your child in a defensive, then you can ask all kinds of questions. So I started saying, how come you've been using my credit card to take Uber all these months? Acting like I knew what Uber was. So he's now on the defensive. Then I started peppering him with questions. What do you like about Uber? And he told me, he said, look, I can call the car from a bar. That's a big plus. This is a kid who, left to his own devices, would never go out on the street and hail a taxi cab. So there's something about Uber that attracted him. I said, but these cars must be more expensive than cabs, right? He said, no, they're cheaper than a cab. I said, really? You must wait forever to get these cars, right? He said, they're quicker than a cab. I said, they're cheaper than a cab, they're quicker. They must be filthy, right? He said, they're cleaner than a cab. I said, let me get this straight. They're cheaper than a cab, they're quicker than a cab, they're cleaner than a cab. That's when I knew cab service was destined for doom. So I knew this business was going to grow. The one final question I had unresolved was, why Uber? Why couldn't I go down to my basement and build my own ride-sharing service? After all you are is a broker connecting drivers to customers. And there were three answers I came up with. The first was $3 billion. That's how much money they raised from the venture capitalists. Uber had $3 billion, I didn't, so that was a potential advantage. The second is, as Uber signs up drivers, it gets easier for them to grow and more difficult for new people to enter the business, because there's a network you create where new drivers, if they're left to their own devices, will go to the biggest ride-sharing service because that's where the most customers are. And the third is that Uber does collect data about you. If you think that they know nothing about you, you're sadly mistaken. They know where you go and when you go there and how often you go there. They have pictures of demand and supply, and the way this reflects itself, the price for an Uber car at 5:30 in New York City is going to be very different than at 3:30 because they use surge pricing to reflect demand and supply. So at this stage, I kind of understood Uber as a company. Now I'm going to use that as my foundation for telling you my story about Uber, but let me visit Ferrari as a company. In fact, before I do that, one of the things I do when you can't even call this research, right? Because what I did was talk to my son, talk to my niece, talk to an Uber driver. But that to me was the extent of my research. You know, why don't you look at the financial statements? What financial statements? Uber is a private company. The only numbers I had were rumored numbers about how many rides they gave and how much their revenues were. But even if I had financial statements with a young company, I will learn more about the company by talking to people than by poring over those financial statements. So I draw a picture of a company. After I've done my research, I draw a picture of what the company does, what it produces, who buys. So basically, it's my picture of this is my understanding of the company, and this is going to become the platform for making money. So my understanding of Uber as a business is they get to keep 20% of the fares they collect. For them to grow, costs them almost nothing. All they do is add a city. Remember, they don't own the cars, they don't hire the drivers, so they don't require massive infrastructure investments. So that's going to become part of my story, is they're going to be able to scale up pretty quickly, and that's going to be the good news and potentially the bad news for them, and you're going to see why. Let's turn to Ferrari. What business is Ferrari in? Loosely speaking, the automobile business, right? That's bad news, because I have a listing of the 10 worst businesses in the world to be in, and if you want to find the list, go to my blog and check it out. But the automobile business is one of those 10 worst businesses, and here's why. If you look at the automobile business leading into 2015, here's what I saw. I saw pretty anemic revenue growth, about 5.6% a year for the previous 10 years globally. Horrible operating margins. The median operating margin for an automobile company is about 4.4%, and 1/3 of all automobile companies lose money. So they have low revenue growth, anemic margins. And usually you get a bonus if you don't have much revenue growth, you don't have to reinvest very much. That's not true for automobile companies. Over the last 10 years, they've had to reinvest more and more, not in assembly lines, but in R&D. You're saying, what kind of R&D? A car is half computer now, so they've had to invest in that technology increasingly. You put that triple whammy together, you get the trifecta. You get low revenue growth, low margins, and high reinvestment. You have a bad business. And it manifests itself in a very simple way. In 9 of the 10 years leading into 2015, the automobile business collectively earned a return on capital less than its cost of capital in 9 of those 10 years. That's the bad news. They're part of a bad business. The good news is Ferrari is not just another car company. In fact, I'm not even sure it's a car. It's a very impractical car if you think about it. There's one guy in my town who owns a Ferrari. I've never seen him drive it. It's kept in this extra secured garage with 2 guards in front. You can break into his house multiple times if you want, but his car is protected. Rumor is once every year he brings the car out, drives it around town, and drives it back into the garage. And who can blame the guy? Where are you going to drive the car? Imagine grocery shopping in your Ferrari. You park your car, you go to the grocery store, you come out, there's $15,000 worth of damage. How about carpool in a Ferrari? That'll be interesting. 4 kids to pick up 1 seat. So if you think about it, this is a strange car to buy, right? A car that costs you more than $1 million that you never drive. So why do you buy a Ferrari? There's a simple answer. You buy a Ferrari because you want to be part of an exclusive club. So if you look at the automobile business, it's collectively a horrible business, but let me show you Ferrari's business. In 2014, the entire year, Ferrari sold 7,255 cars. That's it. 7,255. Think about it. That's probably how many cars Volkswagen probably rejects on its assembly line every day. 7,255? That's not very many. You think this is awful. That's the bad news. The good news is its operating margin is 18.2% on those cars, as opposed to what? The typical automobile margin is 4.4%. They make 18.2%. Why? The prices they charge are sky high, and they spend nothing on advertising. Have you ever seen a Ferrari ad? 10% off, come on in. I've never seen one. Because the kind of people who come on in are not the kind of people they want buying Ferraris. In fact, I'm not even sure how you buy a Ferrari. You go into a dealership, they probably ask you for references. How many billionaires do you know? None, get out of here. This is an exclusive club, and that's going to frame the story I tell about Ferrari, because it's going to mean that if they want to do what they're doing, I have to keep them exclusive. It's going to color the kind of story I have to tell about Ferrari. So now comes the part where I take what I know about each of these companies and I convert them into stories. 2 suggestions when you tell business stories. First, remember, you're not George R. Martin. I still remember about 10 years ago, my oldest son gives me a reading suggestion. He says, "You should read this book, Dad. It's an amazing book." And he hands me this 1,000-page book that as I picked it up, I almost fell over. It's written by a guy called George R. Martin. It's, of course, the Game of Thrones book. I got 600 pages into the book. I called my son and said, "Ryan, this isn't working for me. I'm too old for this." There are like hundreds of characters in this book. They die, they come back to life. They're like 6 empires. They roam around. I've given up on this book altogether. Don't make your business story the Game of Thrones. You don't have 7 seasons and 70 episodes to tell your story. If you're lucky, you might have 5 to 10 minutes. So it's got to be simple, and it's got to be focused. Focused on what? What's the end game for every business? You've got to tell me how you plan to make money. Not next year. Give me a pathway. I understand if you're a young startup that you don't expect to make money next year, but tell me how you plan to make money. Keep it simple, keep it focused. And I'm going to keep that in mind as I tell you my stories about Uber and Ferrari. And these stories are based on what you saw me learn about the companies. So here was my Uber story in June of 2014. And as I tell the story, listen in on every word, because every word is going to have a consequence for me in my valuation. I described Uber as an urban car service company. Already, what am I telling you about where I see Uber succeeding? Urban basically means in cities and big towns, car service as their basic business. That's going to attract new users into the business, like whom? Like my son, who would normally never take a car service, who's going to take Uber. With local networking benefits. What does that mean? If Uber becomes the largest car service company in New York, there's going to be a tipping point where they're essentially going to dominate the market. Why? Because other players can't even compete with them. You think, what's the local doing in there? If Uber becomes the largest car service company in New York and I fly to Chicago, I don't care who the largest car service company in New York is. I care about the largest car service company in Chicago, and that could be Lyft. So in my story, here's what can happen. Uber can end up dominating New York, Lyft can end up dominating Chicago, Didi Chuxing can end up dominating Beijing, and Ola can end up dominating Mumbai. And that's going to have consequences for the numbers you see in my valuation. I'm going to assume that Uber is going to be able to keep doing what they're doing, keep 20% of every fare, which is completely arbitrary if you think about it, and keep growing without investing in new cars or hiring the drivers, that low capital intensity model. So an urban car service company, attracting new users, local networking benefits, keep this 80-20 mix, and grow without much capital investment. That's going to be my Uber story in June of 2014. My Ferrari story is very simple. They're going to stay an exclusive club with all its good and bad parts. Let's start with the bad part. If you have an exclusive club, you can't give them 15% revenue growth. It's not because they can't sell more cars, but if they sell more cars, what's going to happen? That guy who has a car in a garage that he never drives is going to say, there are 2 other people in my town who have Ferraris. This isn't working for me. I'm going to sell my Ferrari, so I've got to keep my revenue growth low. But I'm going to give them the good stuff as well. I'm going to let them keep high margins. And here's the final bonus. Normally when you sell high-priced goods, luxury goods, you're very sensitive to how the economy is doing. Ferrari sells so few cars to people who are so rich that if you ask them, how's the economy doing? Their reaction is, what's an economy? Because their idea of a bad year is they're worth only $4 billion rather than $7 billion. They're not exactly cutting costs. And the way this shows up is the number of cars that Ferrari has sold has stayed around 7,000 for much of the last 10 years. Including 2009, the year after the crisis, they still sold as many cars. So that's going to become my story for Ferrari in 2015. Now, before I convert these stories into a valuation, let me flesh out whether these stories are possible, plausible, or probable. Just to give you a sense of the difference between these 2 numbers. Are there any Yankee fans in this crowd? Okay. If you're not a Yankee fan, think of whatever team you're a fan of. I'm a Yankee fan. They won today, 4-4. They're at 500. Is it possible the Yankees could go 158-4 this season, win the remaining 150? Possible. It's possible. Why? It can happen. They could win they have to win 154 consecutive games. Of course it's possible. Is it plausible? Of course not. Is it probable? Not even likely. Now do you see the difference between possible, plausible, and probable? Lots of stories are possible, a subset are plausible, an even smaller subset are probable. So when I look at a business story, that's the question I need to ask. Is this story possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? And remember, I'm asking the story questions about my own story, and it's so easy to delude yourself. So I'm going to give you examples of impossible stories, implausible stories, and improbable stories. Let's start with impossible stories. About 7 or 8 months ago, I took an investment bank to task for what I called an inept valuation. I won't name the investment bank because you have 10,000 people watching and I won't embarrass them. But you can find out which investment bank it is by going to my blog and checking. And the reason I called them inept is they'd done a valuation of Tesla for a fair value. Remember the Tesla Solar City deal, and they called in two investment bankers, and this was a fairness opinion. They did the fairness opinion, and in their fairness opinion, they valued Tesla, which is their job. They got the cash flows for the first 5 years from the Tesla board, which raised the question, how fair is this? And then they put a 6% growth rate forever, beyond the 5th year, in Tesla's earnings and cash flows. My first reaction is, what currency are you guys doing the valuation in? Maybe it's Argentine pesos, in which case 6% is okay. What will happen to Tesla if it grows 6% a year forever in an economy growing at 2 to 3%? This is a mathematical problem, right? You let one number grow at 6%, another number grow at 2 to 3%. At some point in time, your company is going to become the economy. Okay, globalization, let's keep going. 25 years later, Tesla will be the global economy. I can't even visualize a global economy that's all Tesla all the time. You'd have to live in your Tesla, you'd have to eat your Tesla, you'd have health care from your Tesla. It's an impossible valuation. You'd be surprised at how many discounted cash flow valuations I see with big names on the front, which are impossible valuations. There's nothing to debate. A 6% growth rate forever, it's not going to happen. You said depreciation above CapEx forever. It can't happen. Accounting-wise, you get to depreciate what you CapEx. An amazing number of valuations are impossible. Let's say it's a possible valuation. The next question I'm going to ask you is it plausible? An implausible valuation I'll give you an example of an implausible valuation. You value a company, you tell me it's going to grow, and it's going to grow without reinvesting. That's uncommon. But if you can tell me a really good reason why that can happen, I'm going to let you go. I'll give you an example. A few months ago, a student of mine sends me a valuation of an NFL team. He works for the NFL. He values an NFL team. He sends it to me. And I look at the valuation. He's built in a 3% growth rate with no reinvestment. They own their own stadium, and they're not putting any money back maintaining the stadium. So I pushed back and I said, how come you're not maintaining the stadium? Shouldn't there be money back? He said, that's not a problem. Every time we need to get our stadium redone, here's what we do. We go to the city and we threaten them. With what? We're moving to Las Vegas. We're moving to LA. And the city picks up the tab and says, okay, now I get it. That's an implausible value. But you see the difference? Impossible valuation, there's no escape hatch. Implausible, if you can give me a good reason, I'm okay with it. And then you have improbable valuations. Improbable valuations are ones, the way I think about valuation is I call it the valuation triangle. One side of the triangle is growth, the second side is reinvestment, the third side is risk. So if I throw one side at you and you say it's a high growth company, what should I expect to see on the reinvestment side? I'd expect to see high reinvestment and high risk. High, high, high makes sense. Low, low, low makes sense. But you turn in a valuation, we have high growth, low reinvestment, low risk. I'm going to push back and say, tell me what's special about the company. And if you have a really good story, I'm going to say, I'm okay with that. Impossible, implausible, improbable valuations. When I did my Uber story, I passed it through all 3 tests. I felt pretty comfortable with my story. I'm describing it as an urban car service company. It's already succeeding as an urban car service company. So at least in my story, I felt it passed all 3 tests. At the time that I did this, people said, how come you're not treating it as a replacement for a second car? There was a story about how Uber could replace your second car. In June of 2014, I wasn't willing to go there because I felt it was still an improbable part of the story. September of 2015, I changed my story. Stories can change as facts change around you. Now, just to show you how sometimes you can let this get away from you. There are times when a story sounds so good, you want it to be true. And because you want it to be true, you don't ask any questions. Let's do a little game. You quit whatever job you're doing because you're bored. You become a movie producer, you move to LA. You hang out at the Beverly Hills Hilton. I'm going to pitch a movie idea with you, and you tell me whether you like this idea. It's about a 19-year-old who drops out of Stanford. That's pretty interesting, right? What's the admission rate at Stanford? Minus 3%? Most selective school in the country, you get in and you drop out. This 19-year-old is a woman. That makes it even more interesting. You usually have male geeks dropping out, creating tech companies. This is a woman dropping out of Stanford. She's going to start a business, but not a tech business, but a blood testing business. And here's what she's going to do. She's going to start a business where she's going to take 2 drops of your blood instead of the 2 buckets they seem to take right now. Do 32 tests on the blood in 35 minutes. Send you the results by email, and so the whole thing's going to cost you like $50. Don't you want the story to be true? I think most people did. I wish I'd made up this story because it's a true story. The person who dropped out of Stanford is Elizabeth Holmes. The company she created was a company called Theranos. And a brief period in time, it actually had a pricing of $9 billion attached to it by some of the smartest venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. And Cleveland Clinic and Walgreens had both said, we're on the bandwagon too. So in the middle of 2015, you asked me if there's any substance to Theranos. I'd have said, there must be. Look, all these big names have attached themselves to it. Now, if you're investing in a blood testing company, what's the first question you're going to ask before you put your money in the company? This is not a social media company or an app download company. It's a blood testing company. The question you're going to ask is, does it work, right? I assumed that somebody would have asked this question before pushing up the pricing to $9 billion. But I was wrong, because in October of 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter decides to ask this question. He goes to the FDA and he says, how many of these 32 tests has Theranos been approved for? The FDA said 1. So what about the other 31? Well, couldn't approve them because they're too noisy. I said, what's a noisy test? I'll give you the analogy and you're not going to like it. You go for a leukemia test and the test comes back and the doctor looks and says, you know what, you might have leukemia or you might not. Don't worry about it. When it's more definitive, I'll let you know. This is not exactly a feature you look for in a blood test, noisy blood test. October of 2015, then all heck breaks loose in the company, in a sense. If you read the rest of the history, by June of 2016, the company had been shut down. Elizabeth Holmes had been banned from being in the blood testing business for the next 3 years. But the big question was, how did all these bright people invest in a company without asking the question? The only answer I can give is they wanted the story. I call these runaway stories. Stories that are so good, you want them to be true. I would love to say that if I'd been one of the investors, I'd have asked the question, but I'm not sure I would have wanted to. Asking Elizabeth Holmes whether the blood test works would have been like I'd have felt like the hunter who killed Bambi's mother, right? I mean, you're killing one of the great stories of all time. And all too often, stories can run away from you, especially if they're really good stories. I'm going to move forward because I want to kind of complete the cycle now. I've told you stories about Uber and Ferrari. Now it's time to convert those stories into numbers. So let me take the Uber story and convert them into numbers. I described Uber as an urban car service company, right? The way this is going to show up in my valuation is my total market for Uber, the market they're going after, becomes the urban car service market, which is $100 billion. I described Uber as bringing in new customers into the business. The way this showed up in my valuation is if you look at the car service business leading into 2014, it was growing at about 2 to 3%. I let it grow at 6%, new customers coming in. I described Uber as having local networking benefits. You know where it shows up? When I gave a market share for Uber in this, as a successful company, I gave them a 10% market share. Huge relative to the existing car service companies, but not a 40 or a 50% market share, because in my story, different companies dominate different cities. I assume they can maintain that 80-20 mix. The way this shows up is their operating margins, if they become a mature company, are going to be astronomically high, because they're getting 20% for doing pretty much nothing. And I also described Uber as being able to continue doing what they're doing, not buying the cars, not hiring the drivers. The way this is going to show up in my valuation is when they have to grow, they don't have to reinvest very much. Every dollar that Uber invests creates $5 of revenues. That's about 2.5 times higher than a typical US company. And to bring it all to fruition, I'm going to discount back at a risky discount rate. Why? Because Uber is a young company losing money. Bad things can happen. I gave them a cost of capital of 12%, and I'd love to tell you I built up to the beta and a risk premium. I didn't. I just went to the 95th percentile of cost of capital for US companies in 2014, and I said that's what I'm going to give them. This is the last number I want to obsess about and spend time on because it's not driving my valuation. I've converted my story into numbers. And in fact, I did exactly the same thing with Ferrari. Because I called Ferrari an exclusive club, I converted the story into numbers. But with Uber, when I converted the story into numbers, those numbers became my spreadsheet. So when you look at the spreadsheet, it looks like a typical valuation spreadsheet. But if in this spreadsheet, you point to any number on the spreadsheet and ask me, why is that number what it is? The answer you're going to get is a story. So you ask me, why are Uber's revenues $4 billion in year 10? I'm going to tell you it's because I think Uber is an urban car service company and I'm giving local networking benefits to them. If you ask me, why are my margins 40%? Because I'm assuming the 80-20 mix is going to survive over time. Every number in this valuation reflects my story. The end product is the value that I attached to Uber as a company with my story and my inputs was about $6 billion. What was the story that got me interested in Uber? A Wall Street Journal story where VCs had priced the company at $17 billion. So I write this blog post, I put it on. 20 minutes later, I get a call from a Wall Street Journal reporter. She must have been waiting for the post to just come out. You know? She says, I read your blog post and I read that you valued Uber at $6 billion. And you do know that the VCs are priced it at $17 billion. I'm fully aware of it. She said, how do you explain the $17 billion? I said, I don't have to. I didn't pay it. I've never felt the urge to go around explaining what other people pay. All I can do in valuation is value a company and tell you what I'll do. I can't tell you what to do. Your story and your valuation should drive your decision. So this is my valuation, and all it tells me is I'm not an investor in Uber. That's it. I did the same thing for Ferrari. It's an exclusive club, right? The way this manifests itself is I gave them a low revenue growth, only 4%. You're saying that's awful. That's the bad news. The good news is I gave them 18% margins and a low cost of capital. Why? Because they're selling to people who are so wealthy that they don't feel the effects of the economy. Low revenue growth, high margins, low cost of capital. The value that I attached to Ferrari based on that story was 6.3 billion euros. It actually went public at about 8 billion. It rose to 9 billion, dropped back to 7. It's gone back and forth. But that's a different issue. There's the pricing game, there's the value game, and your job is to come up with the value and compare to the price. And this is my value based on my story. We're almost towards the end because I want to give some time for questions. Last step in this process is to keep the feedback loop open. Remember what I said? Go to places where people disagree with you. I got incredibly lucky on my Uber post. It got picked up in 4 different places. The first was a site called 538. Go to 538. It's a Nate Silver site. It's a number geek site. It's where number geeks hang out. It's a great site if you've never visited it. The second site it got picked up was the Forbes blog. Who reads that? People over the age of 75, usually, no? Old-time value investors. The third place it got picked up was TechCrunch. Heard of TechCrunch? It's a Silicon Valley favorite. Tech geeks read it. And the fourth place it got picked up was the ride-sharing guide. It's actually a blog written by a guy for Uber and Lyft drivers. Same blog post, same valuation, 4 places, 4 very different sets of reactions. 538, almost every question was about numbers. Why 10% cost of capital? Why not 9.98%? This is how numbers geeks think, right? Why the second decimal point? The Forbes blog, people loved it. They said, this is the way people should value companies. Those crazy tech people. I didn't even visit the Forbes blog. The TechCrunch people absolutely hated it. Their reaction was, how dare you value one of ours? How dare you bring one of your D.C.Fs into our arena? And they just picked it apart. I hate this, you're not getting this. 90% was pure abuse, nothing you can learn from it. But the 10% that actually told me things about the tech business that I would never have known. I'm not a tech person, I don't know about this business. They told me things about the business I would never have known. And on the last side, the ride-sharing guide, I heard from drivers about things that Uber did that I would never have learned on my own. They said, for instance, in LA, you drive more than 30 hours, they kick back a portion of that 20% to you because they want people to drive more than 30 hours. So effectively, they're not making 20%, they're making only 12%. I would never have learned this if I talked to Uber's top management. Wherever I go in the world, I get into a car, I drive people crazy. I ask them questions. So why do you do that? There's an Uber here. Who are the car service companies? They think I'm crazy, but I'm collecting information. I should probably charge this off against my taxes. Every time I talk, I'm collecting information. In fact, this all came to fruition for me when I was sitting in Munich airport waiting for a connecting flight. And I get an email from a guy called Bill Gurley. For those of you who don't know who Bill is a partner at Benchmark Capital, which was one of the early investors in Uber. They invested in Uber at a $2 billion value. He's actually in the board of directors for Uber. So let me ask you a question. Do you think Bill knows a lot more about Uber than I do? Absolutely. So I open the email. I have an hour and a half for my flight, and here's what he says. He says, I read your post on Uber and I didn't like it. I said, okay. He says, I've written my own post to counter yours, and I've said some mean things about you, and I just wanted to let you know. So I close the email. I've got an hour and a half to go. So guess where I go next? I go to Bill's blog and I read his post. It says, Damodaran misses by a mile. Get it, Uber driving misses by a mile. And he takes issue with every part of my story. He says, Uber is not a car service company, it's a logistics company. See how words can have consequences? When you say logistics, you all of a sudden expanded your business from car service to delivery and moving. You've increased your total market. He said, we're not just urban, we're going to be everywhere. He gave examples of suburban, rural services they were going to. And he said, we're connecting up with credit card companies and airlines so that when you fly to Jakarta and you make your reservation on United, right below, before they drag you off the plane, okay, there's going to be a button that says you hit this and there's going to be an Uber car waiting for you. And the story he was saying is, we're going to make our local networking benefits global. I was fascinated by this story. He thought I was going to be pissed off. So I actually took a story, and while I was waiting for my plane, I went into my valuation and I changed 3 numbers. Actually, just 2 numbers. I changed my total market from the 100 billion to 300 billion. Logistics market is about 3 times the size. I gave him a 40% market share. That's what a global networking benefit does. And I came up with a $53 billion value. I actually emailed it to Bill and I said, do you like this? He said, a lot. Then he said, you know what, this 80-20 mix is probably going to be history. It's probably going to be closer to 90-10. Not a problem. I still had time for my flight. I changed the 80-20 to 90-10. I get a $29 billion value. What I'm trying to say is not that any number goes. And in fact, in December of 2014, I actually posted on my blog a way in which people could value Uber on their own, where I let them pick what they thought Uber was. So if you get a chance, visit my blog. I let you decide whether Uber is a transportation company, a logistics company, car service company, whether there's no networking benefits, local or global. And at the end of the process, I say, given your story, here's your value for Uber. And it could be anywhere from less than $1 billion to over $90 billion. I get calls almost every day from somebody who's convinced that some stock is in a bubble. And that's what they want me to say. That stock is in a bubble. Those people are crazy. That's hubris. How do I know that a stock is in a bubble? All I can say is I won't buy that stock given my story. It's not my job to tell people Uber's not worth $71 billion. Maybe you have a story that justifies the $71 billion. So my advice to you is pick your favorite company or least favorite company. It can be Valiant, it can be United, it can be... Tell your story. And remember, the story that you tell is not timeless. As things change around you, your story has to change. The biggest problem, the biggest enemy I have when I tell stories and convert them into valuations is me. Because once I tell a story, I feel the urge to hang on to that story. That's a behavioral component in me. I have to learn to keep the door open, to revise and review my story and say the 3 words that I think are the most freeing words for every investor. You know what they are? I was wrong. Because once you say that, it opens the door to being able to revisit your story and look at what you got wrong. So I'm ready for any questions you might have. And if you want, almost everything I said, there's an expanded version of it on my website, so you can visit them. It's not a problem. I need my glasses, right? Yeah. First question was, what career advice would I give a business or a finance student who's entering the workforce today? Be like Brunelleschi. You have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Last summer, I was actually in my family in Florence, and if you've ever been in Florence, you've seen the Duomo. And the Duomo, of course, was built by Brunelleschi, but it's built on a church that was actually, they built the church first. And they wanted to build a dome, but they didn't know how to build a dome. And for 150 years, they left the church without, talk about faith. That's true faith, to build a church and say, somebody's going to figure out how to build a dome. We're going to leave it undomed for 150 years. So the next time you get impatient because you've been holding a stock for 6 weeks and things haven't gone your way, those guys had 150 years and they were willing to wait. That's the definition of faith. But to make a long story short, this guy called Brunelleschi was an artist, was given this mission of building this dome. So he was an artist. He knew nothing about architecture. He knew nothing about science, but he actually taught himself enough architecture, enough science, enough building to actually build the dome. That's a Renaissance man, right? We have become a world of specialists. At an age of 18, my youngest is going off to college. Already he's being asked to pick. Do you want to be a numbers person or a story person? Do you want to go into business? Do you want to go into literature? And I think we're doing ourselves a disservice because what we need are more people who can go across disciplines, storytellers and number crunchers. So I would say pick your weak side and work on it. So if you're really good with numbers, work on your weak side, which is telling stories. If you're really good with stories, work on your weak side, which is working with numbers. We need more people who can walk back and forth across disciplines, because without that, we're going to end up with the problems we have today. You look at 2008 and say, how could this happen? This is what happens when people have tunnel vision. They've lost all perspective because they've become so specialized that they can't see what's going on. I'm going to get my glasses before I do it. What happens when you get too old to read without glasses? Sorry if you missed me on the... Oh, here's a question that I absolutely hate answering, but it's been asked, so I have to give you an answer. Are U.S. equity markets overvalued today? Why or why not? I am not a market timer. So I could give you an answer, but I have absolutely no faith in that answer. The way I try to answer that question actually is I compute an implied equity risk premium at the start of every month. You're saying, how is that answering my question? Go back and read the implied equity risk premium is the price of risk in the equity market. So basically it's what investors are charging for risk. When that number gets really low, you have a problem. That's in 1999, for instance, that number was 2%. People were accepting a 2% price for risk in the equity market. That's an overvalued market. The implied equity risk premium now is about 5%, which is well above historic norms. So I'm not saying stocks are undervalued, stocks are overvalued, but there's nothing in the numbers that leads me to freak out right now. You know why we worry about bubbles? The longer a bull market lasts, the more you're afraid that the other shoe is going to drop. Okay? So I'm not a great believer in single metrics. I don't believe in P, I don't believe in Shiller P's, I don't believe in any metric telling me whether stocks are overvalued or undervalued. So I don't try to time markets, I try to pick stocks. That's all I can do. Play the game you came to play. The game I came to play is, I play the investing game, I buy individual companies. I didn't come to play the market timing game. And if I try to play games I did not come to play, it always gets me into trouble. How important are managers in the story of a company? Let me ask you a question. Do you think Elon Musk is critical to the Tesla story? He is the Tesla story, right? In fact, Tesla and Elon Musk, it's tough to tell whether you're telling a story about Elon Musk or a story about Tesla. For young companies, the manager is a critical part of the company because you're the storyteller. There's a reason why Amazon is such an incredibly successful company. Jeff Bezos has not only told the same story for 20 years, he's been incredibly consistent about acting in accordance with that story. So the younger the company, the more managers matter because they tell the stories. The older a company becomes, I hate to say this if you work at an old company, the less you tend to matter as a manager. You can do bad things to companies, but you can't do much good at these companies. So if you're a CEO of ExxonMobil, I don't know who you are and I don't care who you are, because if I'm investing in ExxonMobil, You know what I'm betting on? The oil price. The R squared, the correlation between ExxonMobil's earnings and the oil price is 96%. Who cares who the CEO of ExxonMobil is? What are they going to do? Come and watch the terminal a little harder and see the oil price go up? So as companies age, the importance of managers is going to fade because the numbers start to dominate how you think about a company. But for young companies, it's an incredibly important factor. Knowing what you know, you could take any company's numbers and make them look better or worse. What does that say? That bias rules? If you really, really want to do something, there is nothing I'm going to be able to do to stop you from doing it. In other words, you really want to buy a stock, you're going to find a way to buy a stock. The biggest enemy we have as investors is we make decisions first, and then we go do the analysis. And guess what? The analysis always backs our decisions. You say, look, I made it because I found the stock. Don't lie to me. You wanted to buy the stock. You see everybody else making money on Tesla. You feel left out. So you buy Tesla, and then you do a reverse. I call these kabuki DCFs. Because you act like you're doing a valuation. You make up the cash flows. You make up a discount rate. You say, look, I came up with a value of $350 per share. So if you really want to make something better or worse, you're going to do it. Nothing I do will stop you. And to me, actually, stories are a good way of kind of forcing you to think about what you're doing. What are my thoughts on Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies? I try not to think about them, so I'm going to pass on those. Hey, actually, let me take that back. You can't value Bitcoin, you can price it. You can't value gold, you can price it. You can only value assets which produce cash flows. So if you ask me what's the right price for gold, we can debate that because gold is an alternate currency. If you ask me what's the right price for Bitcoin, we can debate that. But there's no value for Bitcoin or a value for gold because those are not cash flow generating assets. What company is undervalued so we can buy the stock? I actually have a lot of Valiant that I need to see go up because I've lost so much money on the stock. So why don't you guys all load up on Valiant, push up the price so I can get out tomorrow and leave you with the biggest disaster of all time in your portfolios, right? But that actually is a fascinating company in terms of how the story has shifted over a 2-year period. It's gone from the superstar to a cash cow to a dog overnight, in a sense. It's almost over a 6-month period it made that transition. So it's actually amazing how quickly the story in that company shifted and the value kind of reflected. Okay? I can't even read the writing on that page, so I'm going to skip that. That's pretty much it. I think how do you account for the probability of a substitute appearing in your valuation? Use more statistics. We underutilize probability in statistics and valuation, decision trees, simulations, scenario analysis. Open up your toolkit. That statistics class you absolutely hated 25, 30, 50 years ago, whenever you took it, might be the most useful class you ever took. You just never knew it. Okay. That's about it. Thank you very much.
Those were some wonderful stories. You can continue it with Narrative and Numbers, which is on sale now. And thank you for all of those from around the globe who joined us this evening.